So good evening, everybody. Before we start, I have to make a short announcement. Because of 2 holidays and my corona, we lost 2 lectures and we will have 2 additional dates. The first will be Friday, 16th of December, from 2:30 to 4 o'clock, here in the same room. And the second will be Monday, the 9th of January, from 12 to 1:30, also here in this room. And the second exam, if you're interested in this, will be the 1st of March, from 5 o'clock to 6:30. But this is now important, not in this room, but in Vordere Zollernstraße, in the room 20, on the 4th floor. I will write you this in the base, but at least I told you now. Of course, these dates, these additional dates are not mandatory, because perhaps you don't have time, but yes. You will see whether you manage. So, as you see today, we talk about ethical concepts about evil, mortal sins, and virtues. What is evil? Evil is not a substance. In order to define evil as a concept, we must first have a system of norms that establishes what is good and what is bad. This having been said, everyone has experienced evil. The evil that exists in the world, the evil that is inflicted upon us, but also the evil that is within us. Is evil a constant? No. Evil is a notion that varies according to context, a notion that has changed over the course of history and from one culture to another. For example, infanticide has not always been perceived as an evil. Sexual intercourse between adult males and male juveniles is considered criminal today. But in ancient times, it was not. To go to war and kill people who have done you no harm is still not seen as an evil. One might ask why. As a rule, it is and has always been the others who are qualified as evil or bad. Qualifying them as such has enormous consequences. It legitimizes the exclusion or marginalization and even the killing of the others in question. It's worth remarking that those who stigmatize entire categories of people as evil or bad always uses stigmatization as a rallying principle to commit the most heinous crimes themselves. The notion good versus evil often serves to legitimize crimes, including the liquidation of those branded as evil or bad. For example, Jewish, communists, terrorists, Roma, people who think differently, people who have taken a political stand against something, etc. Whenever a group of individuals, a religion, social groups, political parties stigmatize entire categories of people in this way and exclude or marginalize them as consequence, we have to be very careful. Such generalized conceptions of people persists and have far-reaching implications and consequences. They have a long tradition, and that is what we would now like to investigate. Who has the power to determine what and who is good or evil? Religious systems proceed from the assumption that it is a numinous entity, in other words, God, who defines ethical norms. But in actual fact, man establishes the criteria. If we want to understand how moral conceptions take shape, we have to look at history. Taking a good look at history is fundamentally important if we are to understand the present. Take the case in point. Realizing just how the very concept of evil came about and how it has changed over time enables us to grapple in a more nuanced way with the evil that affects us today. It is essential today that we give serious thought to the notion of ethics. Ethics with an intersubjective orientation. Ethics that govern what we should or indeed should not do to our fellow human beings and to nature. It's beyond my scope to give a lecture on the history of ethics or on a current ethical concept. As a Kulturwissenschaftlerin, that is, as a person who devotes herself to the study and analysis of culture and its workings, I can only show you that ethics, like many other fundamental notions, is not an essentialist category, but rather one that is created by human beings and therefore susceptible of being consciously conceptualized by us. As an art historian, I can show you how ethical conceptions have been represented in art, how forms of visual representation can contribute to creating ethical norms, how they can reinforce prevailing conceptions or question and subvert them. We shall focus on Western Christian culture, although it would certainly be worthwhile comparing Christian culture with, say, Buddhist or Hindu culture. In the previous lecture, we saw that it was Christianity that first systematized the concept of a hereafter, and it did so in the form of a dichotomy, heaven and hell. There are the good and there are the bad. This concept in this form was a novelty at the time. And if we are to judge by everyday experience, it's a notion that is by no means self-evident. This idea of an absolute dichotomy presupposes a monotheistic system of belief. It is only when God is seen as being unique, as being the very embodiment of truth and what is good, that the notion of absolute evil can exist. In polytheistic religions, there are gods who are characteristically ambivalent. The gods of antiquity are mighty, but when they are not benevolently minded, they can inflict considerable harm. In addition, the deeds they perform are at times of a dubious nature. Early premises for the dichotomy between good and evil can be found in Iran, in the teachings of Zarathustra, and then later in the 2nd century BC, in the preachings of Mani, where Ahura Mazda, this is a principle of good, constantly struggles against Ahriman. In Judaism, there were the 10 Commandments and clear moral precepts, but there was no devil, no hell. That is, not until the 2nd century BC, which was a period of crisis and one that saw the expulsion of the Jews. Up until then, Satan, think about the history of Job, for instance, Satan was an angel of God, a messenger, who, at God's bidding, tempted man, but put obstacles in his path. But he was not God's antagonist. Philosophical reflection on ethics began in Greek antiquity with Socrates, to whom Plato gave a voice in his dialogues. Aristotle was the first to clearly take on the subject of ethics, making reference to Socrates. In Aristotle's view, there is good and bad, but not evil. What is bad is not good for me, or is not good for someone, or is not good with respect to something specific. There is no absolute good. There is only a concrete good for someone in a concrete situation. In antiquity, the actual issue at bottom was that of man's true happiness. Self-interest and intersubjectivity are mutually consistent. Only a moral life can be a good and happy life. It was Christianity that first posited the notion of absolute evil, although not in its original form. It's important, I told you this already, but I repeat it, it's important to point out that the earliest surviving testimonies in this regard are not from Jesus himself, but from Paul, and also from the four Gospels, which were written between 70 and 120 after the death of Christ. Of the four evangelists, Matthew is the one who goes into greatest detail when it comes to mentioning the Last Judgment and, consequently, good and evil. These few verses, it's Matthew chapter 25, these few verses constitute the basis of what will become the Christian conception of hell. The passage describes the second coming of Christ, the separation of the sheep from the goats, left and right. To the writers, Christ says, I quote now, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me." Then the writers will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you? The king will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." Then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared by my Father for the devil and his angels." Then they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. End of quote. In the first 4 centuries, there existed very diverse currents and factions, some of which were in fierce conflict with one another. In her book, The Origin of Satan, first published in 1995, Elaine Pagels shows how the concept of Satan gradually evolved in the 1st century before Christ and how it then acquired a more severe character in the centuries following Christ. At each phase of this evolution, the aim was to demonize those who were perceived as being different. First, it was the Jews who had not become Christians. It was the heathens. Then it was the so-called heretics who held views that differed from the prevailing doctrine. It was in the struggle to impose what was held to be only true faith that the concept of fundamental evil was born. Of considerable importance for the later development of the Christian conception of hell was the Ethiopic book of Enoch, dating from the 2nd century BC, as well as the Jewish apocalyptic literature and the Apocalypse of Peter, the later dating from the early 2nd century AD. None of these, however, were included in any canon of scripture. In the 3rd century, the most significant theologian of the Eastern Church, Origenes, tried to demythologize apocalyptic conceptions. He saw hellfire as a metaphor for man's own destructive passions. He considered that little could be said with any degree of certainty about the so-called eternal punishment, as there existed nothing written on the subject. With punishment being meted out sensibly, everyone in the end would be good. Everyone would be with God. Origenes believed in a merciful God. He saw it as a Christian task to attain God's truth in a spirit of joy. And Origenes was executed. Two theologians in particular contributed to forming the widely held conception of hell, and consequently that of evil, namely Augustine around the year 400 and Pope Gregory I around the year 600. Augustine grappled with the question of where evil comes from. In his Confessiones, he recalls an experience he had when he was 16 years old. He, together with some friends, robbed fruit from a pear tree without even being hungry. They did it merely for the pleasure of doing something bad. Unlike Socrates and Plato, who held that badness resulted from ignorance, from a lack of awareness, Augustine believed that there existed such a thing as deliberate evil. Here one is struck by the fact that the wronged person, the owner of the pear tree, is not even mentioned. What that person suffers is not even mentioned. The only thing that seems to matter is Augustine's own spiritual suffering. His self-criticism remains egocentric, as does his relation to God, who is responsible only for the salvation of his soul. For Augustine, what is essential is not so much the deed itself, but rather the will to commit a bad deed. God punishes only bad intentions. Only God can look into a person's soul, and consequently, only God can judge the morality of any given act. In psychohistorical terms, this is a step towards internalization. For Augustine, it is good intentions that matter the most. This viewpoint will later be taken up by Luther. It is not good works that count, but rather good intentions. That is only the inner person which only God can know. Augustine too saw morality as having the individual's own happiness as its main concern, with happiness being understood as the well-being of the soul. Above all, Augustine links ethics to faith. Doing a good deed for the sake of doing a good deed, and not for the sake of one's faith, does not make the deed good. A crucial point to note is that it was Augustine, the most important of the Church Fathers, who canonized the notion of original sins. All human beings are sinful. Before we turn our attention to the privileged place of evil, namely hell, let us take a look at the personification of evil. The personification of evil is the devil. According to Augustine, the gravest of all sin is pride. The lack of humility, the lack of faith. In the first 5 centuries, there existed no portrayals of the devil, nor did the early Middle Ages see a well-defined iconography of the devil develop. In the Middle Ages, what one most commonly saw were bestial hybrid creatures, which, however, were not at all evocative of the mortal sin of pride. When you think of the devil, what usually comes to mind is basically a bestial hybrid creature with hairy goat legs, a tail, horns, and pointed ears. This creature has a clear genealogy that dates back to antiquity. It is a combination of a satyr figure and the god of shepherds, Pan. In antiquity, neither of these was by any means an incarnation of evil. Rather, they both stood for primordial sensuality. From the Christian point of view, however, the incarnation of sensuality and sexuality is evil itself. 2 aspects become apparent here. On the one hand, a break with antiquity, and on the other hand, the vital importance of visual images. For in no written text is it stated that sexual sin is the greatest of all sins. On the visual level, however, precisely that is what is communicated here with enormous consequences. So you see that this example shows how important visual representations are, and it shows that they are by no means exclusively illustrations of texts. Beginning with Pope Gregory I, hell becomes a theme of central importance, As does purgatory, by virtue of sacrifice of the Mass, the Church has a considerable share in the salvation of man's soul. It's interesting to know that houses of God, which are supposed to serve as a purpose of spreading the divine gospel, see themselves being gradually transformed into chambers of horror. However, when it came to describing the torments of hell, theologians were not the only ones to have a say. Visions of hell and legions came into being, such as the vision of Brandon and that of Tuntal, both of which describe the various torments of hell with graphic vividness. A culmination was reached in the 12th century. What becomes manifest in these visions? You see here the very famous Giotto. So what becomes manifest in these visions? Above all, fears. Fears of illness, fears of natural disasters, war and violence, sexual phobias, but also punishment for justice that doesn't exist. Hatred and aggression have their place here and can therefore be visually represented. There is the inner hell and the outer hell. One can ask what the function of such images can be. Is it catharsis? Is the objective to frighten? On the other hand, many who have seen such images might then have visions of their own that are based on those images, and they might give those visions names and thus build up their own repertory of fantasies. When confessing, an individual can actually fancy having committed the sin and that he or she is describing, if only in his or her imagination. In hell, chaos rules, but it is also a lively place, a place for the fantastic. Here we see the continuation of pagan, Germanic and Celtic structures, as opposed to structures of antiquity. This is what hell looks like. And I give you another example of Giovanni da Modena. Here we have a very interesting detail. As you see, right from the devil, you see a rock, and on this rock a naked person, and this is Mohammed. There is a scripture below him called Mohammed. And what is also very interesting is that a few years ago some very radical Islamists wanted to bomb the whole church, which is one of the most important churches, San Petronia in Bologna. But they didn't reach this. But it shows, you know, the importance of these images still today. So this is hell, and look, this is paradise. In paradise, there is order, there is harmony, maybe boredom as well. All souls are alike. They subordinate themselves to God and the angels. Will no longer exists. However, the depersonalization, the strict falling into line, And the obedience also that this submission to power is a condition for being freed from fear and pain. So the question is really if you would like to be in this kind of paradise with this old man and singing the whole day Hallelujah, sitting on this very uncomfortable banks. It was not until the 13th or 14th century that hell began to acquire a certain structure. Closer attention began to be paid to specific punishment for individual sins, with most of the punishment being related to the deadly sins. And you see it here. It's gula, gluttony, superbia, vainglory or pride. Avaritia, that is greed or covetousness. Accedia, that is sloth. Luxuria, lust. Invidia, envy, and ira, this is wrath or anger. We will come back to this. Beginning with the Trecento conceptions of hell are often inspired by Dante's Divine Comedy, Divina Commedia. So I show you the example of Nardo di Ciuna. You don't see a lot, but you see that this hell is really structured. And it's structured after Dante's Commedia, or I show you another example here. Dante himself was very much influenced by visual imagery, but also by numerous written sources, including writings dating from antiquity, such as those of Aristotle and Virgil, as well as various Christian theological sources and also legends. Dante gathers together the full range of conceptions of hell dating from antiquity and the Middle Ages, including poetry, visions, and theology. Having himself been banished from Florence for political reasons, he makes numerous political allusions in his work. His adversaries find themselves being banished to hell. Dante describes how he loses his way, wandering through the eerie forest, and how he eventually comes upon Virgil, who shows him the way to hell, through which he then guides him. Inscribed over the entrance to hell are the words, Lasciate ogni speranza voi che entrate. Abandon all hope, you who enter here. Dante gives a precise description of the topography. And what I show you now is a work by Sandro Botticelli. Botticelli, about in the years 1480 to 95, made the whole series of this whole book, but unfortunately it is unfinished. There are some drawings and some colored and some colored lately. So you see, you see here the illustration of Dante. For Dante, hell is shaped like a funnel consisting of 8 descending concentric circles, the 8th being in its turn divided into 10 pits or ditches. A further 9th circle, which is the deepest of all, and at the same time the center of the earth, is a frozen lake, in which Lucifer is frozen up to his waist. This circle is inhabited by traitors such as Judas, Brutus, and Cassius. The antechamber of hell is crowded with half-hearted souls, those who never bothered making a choice, those who neither heaven nor hell wants to take in. As Virgil explains, they lived without fame and without shame. They left nothing of themselves behind. Charon ferries Dante and Virgil over the river Acheron to hell proper. The first circle of hell is inhabited by the wise, the poets, and the heroes of antiquity. The second circle is reserved for those who sinned out of passionate love. Tristan, Cleopatra, Achilles, Paris, and particularly touching the story of Paola and Francesca, who, according to Dante, became inflamed with adulterous passion after reading together the tragic romance of Lancelot and Ginevra, King Arthur's queen. Dante himself is shaken to the point of falling into a faint, the poet realizing the power that poetry possesses. And so it goes on. There are, in all these different structures, you have specific sinners. And unfortunately, in the drawing, it's very difficult to see something. Here you have the circle 5. The wrathful are busy tearing each other apart. And in the 6th circle is inhabited by those who led actively evil lives, as well as heretics, those who were ostracized from the church, but also emperors and popes. In hell, circle number 7, you have the murderers and the tyrants, and blasphemers who are seen wading through bloody waters. And then you have the 8th circle, filled with a teeming crowd of sinners, seducers, corrupt public officials, malicious counselors who have sown discord, and so on. And here you have Lucifer himself. The 2 wanderers then arrive in the realm of purgatory and gradually make their ascent up to the mountain of purgatory, Dante atoning for his sins as he climbs the mountain. In part 3 of the Divine Comedy, the woman Dante had so loved in his imagination, Beatrice, now takes on the role of his guide and shows him the way to divine light. In contrast to hell, paradise remains vague and is largely described by means of metaphors having to do with light. I think that's interesting that always when it concerns paradise, it gets very abstract. I show you an example before Botticelli from Giovanni di Paolo, who illustrated in the midst of the 15th century Dante and the Divine Comedy. I think it's wonderful how he paints this. You see here Beatrice guiding Dante and showing him the different planets. And here they come into the center where you have Jesus and Mary and Peter surrounded by angels. In Renaissance Italy, the desire for harmony and for a world that could be grasped by means of optical perspective even led to a certain ordering of hell. I show you, as an example, The Last Judgment by Fra Angelico. According to the nature of the sins committed, or of the punishments that correspond to them, hell is divided up into sections. In this, however, hell differs visually from the absolute symmetry and geometrical order that characterize heaven and paradise. Differently than in Renaissance Italy, in the northern Alpine region, the Last Judgment and consequently hell remained central themes during the 15th and 16th centuries. In the Netherlands and the German regions, it was not at first a matter of reviving notions from antiquity. Particularly with respect to visions of hell, this period kept seeing old Germanic Celtic conceptions being summed up. I show you now this diptych from Van Eyck's Entourage. It's not clear, is it Jan van Eyck or Hubert van Eyck or a third painter, we won't discuss it, but it's of the Eyckian Entourage, depicting the crucifixion and the Last Judgment, paradise and hell. And you see again, paradise is order, hell is chaos. No separate chambers for specific punishments, instead bodies tumbling chaotically one over another. Rather than ceremonial punishment, an unleashed orgy. Oral aggression, the acts of devouring, giving birth and defecating are all made to somehow resemble one another. It would be difficult to talk about evil and hell without mentioning Hieronymus Bosch. But to do Bosch justice, we would require many lecture hours. Here I can only give you a few indications, as inadequate as they may be, of what specifically characterizes Bosch's conception of evil, his conception of hell and paradise. Hieronymus Bosch worked in the North Brabantine town Sertogenbosch in the period roughly between 1480 and 1516. This was literally a time when the earth shook. The discovery of America, the beginnings of early capitalist modes of production, and as a result, the disruption of the organization of skilled crafts around craftsmen's guilds, a system that had been in place since the Middle Ages. It was a time of mass movements in the social and religious sphere. It was the beginning of the Reformation, which meant at the end of Catholic Christian monopoly on truth. One of Bosch's principal works is the so-called Garden of Early Delights. It is dated about 1500-1515. A work that is now in the Prado in Madrid. Within the context of this lecture, I cannot adequately go into the many aspects of the significance of this major work. I would simply like to draw your attention to a few particularities of the way in which paradise and hell have been depicted here. If for no other reason than to point out how Bosch's conception contrasts with that of Renaissance Italy. Paradise, let's be perfectly clear, what is meant here is a paradise associated with the creation and not the paradise of the hereafter. One is struck by the fact that it is not the creation of Eve from Adam's rib, and it's not the fall of man. It's not the expulsion from paradise that is depicted. Instead, we see Christ, and it's not God the Father, it's really Christ, who appears to bring Eve, who has just been created, to Adam, and giving his blessing to their union. This is significant, especially when it comes to interpreting the central panel, which is not to be seen, as it almost always is seen in the research, as representing mankind indulging in sinful behavior. Rather, as I see it, what is being imagined here is a utopia, a counterfactual utopia in an impossible world, beyond any human culture. We see no man-made architecture, no recognizable objects made by man. A topsy-turvy world in which desires and longings, but also fears involved in relation between the sexes become apparent. And by the way, in the same time in history, Thomas Morehouse in London wrote his Utopia. He was the first person ever to write of a utopia. So naturally, Bosch didn't know this, but I just mean that it was a time where this kind of thinking was getting possible. On the one hand, Bosch's paradise contains exotic plants, such as a dragon tree, and there are elephants and giraffes, all of which Bosch could have known from the Nuremberg Chronicle, also known in English as Schädel's World History, or from other stories and portrayals that had come from the New World. But what is more amazing and unusual is that in this so-called paradise, things are not happening in peaceful, paradise-like fashion. We see animals devouring each other. The owl, which for Bosch almost always stands for something spooky and sinister, is seen peering out of its hole. We see repugnant creatures crawling out of the water. So from the very beginning, ambiguity. And what characterizes hell? There are things here that we know from tradition. Lakes of fire and ice, allusions to mortal sins, including greed, lust, gluttony, envy, and also the addiction to gambling, etc. We also see Satan devouring poor souls and discharging them from his bowels. But then there are some conspicuous new elements as well. To begin with, a fantastical aspect, which, however, we already know from the Middle Ages. Here, Bosch combines the metaphorical constructions of medieval drolleries with the realistic paintings that had developed since Van Eyck. Something he is able to do thanks to the new medium of painted panel. The result is that this fantastical quality takes on a new, eerie dimension. The unreal aspect is also due to the distortion of proportions. An oversized key, a pair of gigantic ears. On the other hand, however, this hell is not at all so unreal. Rather, it seems to be, at least in part, a caricature of an abominable reality. In contrast to the central panel, in hell there are architectural forms that are recognizable as real. There are real scenes of war, warriors marching through burning cities. Hell on earth. We have already seen that in the Middle Ages, ecclesiastical dignitaries could also end up in hell. But in Bosch's vision, they actually become devils. Monks and nuns, along with demons, are seen tormenting poor sinners. A criticism of the church that it would be difficult to top. In his 4 panels that are now located in Venice, Bosch creates another scenario of hell and paradise. He imagines the paradise of the hereafter as a funnel of light. He gives no concrete indication of what paradise looks like. Allow me to remark, parenthetically, that the biggest surprise here are the reverse sides of the panels, which were only recently revealed during restoration work. I saw this on the Bosch exposition. I couldn't even believe it, because when you see this, it's a complete abstract, emotionally loaded structure that could be seen as a prefiguring of Jackson Pollock. With Bosch, however, we see yet another conception of evil, namely the evil that exists not in hell, but in man itself. I'd like to show you the painting entitled Chris Mocked, or The Crowning with Thorns. The painting consists of half-length figures, which indicates that it was conceived as a devotional painting. The crowning with thorns, it's as if the action has come to a stop. Christ is not being beaten or whipped. The crown with its long thorns is not being pressed against his head. There is no blood being drawn by thorns digging into his flesh. There are no expansive gestures. The faces have not even been caricatured as particularly malevolent. Rather come across as being earnest, almost with an air of personal concern. The henchman on the right has laid his hand on Christ's shoulder. But precisely this apparent attitude of his renders the gestures almost unbearable. Christ's hand and those of the henchman in the lower left corner of the picture can be seen practically touching each other. However, precisely due to the fact that no apparent ill treatment, in fact no action at all, is shown here, the implicit evil is readily recognizable as inner evil. It is distressing to look at this painting and to try to endure the mournful look in Christ's eyes. In my opinion, this is a very modern way of looking at evil. It is an internalization of evil. the evil of individuals who at first glance do not give the impression of being evil. Evil does not only occur in hell or among Christ's adversaries. There also exists a catalogue of evil, namely the 7 deadly sins. The establishment of a list of deadly sins fluctuated for a long time. In the 13th century cathedral art, there were 12 of them altogether, but it was in fact Pope Gregory I, as early as in the year 600, who set the list at 7. Let's have a look at them. So you see the Pervia, and you see always the English translation, Avaritia, Luxuria, Invidia, Gula, Accidia, and Ira. Actually, these are human drives, all of them, which means, and there is no doubt about it, we are all sinners. Beginning with the 13th century, and even more notably from the 14th century, the sins are represented as actual scenes, whereas the virtues remain abstract allegories. So here, as you see, we have not 7, but 12 vices and virtues. In contrast to the vices, the virtues remain static personifications. They were not embedded in scenes with any kind of action taking place. They differed only in their attributes. So what you see here is courage and cowardice, calmness and anger, and patience and impatience. I think that the reason for the difference between these modes of representation may have been the notion that unlike the virtues, which were seen as normative ideals, the vices were the material from which life was actually made. I show you the so-called table of the 7 deadly sins. It was a long time attributed to Bosch. Now it is not sure whether it is Bosch or not, but that for us that doesn't matter actually. But what you see here is the 4 medallions with the last sins, and then in the circle the 7 deadly sins, and there is the eye of God with Christ showing his wand. And it's very interesting how this is depicted here. Here you have Avaritia, and you see that the sin is shown that it is a class distinction which actually makes this. The judge who listens to the rich one, but he takes also the money of the poor one, or here the causes of envy, which are also be seen in these class distinctions. The bourgeois people have envy to the feudal, and then we have the poor man going away. So you have all 3 classes together. So far we have only spoken about the vices and evil. Maybe we should now take a look at the virtues. The established conception of the virtues is not analogous to that of the vices. The virtues consist, on the one hand, of the 4 cardinal virtues we date back to the antiquity, and on the other hand, the 3 virtues referred to as theological. The cardinal virtues the virtues going back to antiquity, and the notion of virtue was understood quite differently in ancient Greece than in Christian culture. In Greek it is arete, and in Latin it is virtus. This notion referred to the adeptness and aptitude of a well-educated and intellectually and physically developed male person. The Greeks, Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, and the Stoics focused their reflection on virtues rather than on sins. They sought to understand how goodness could be achieved, which for them was above all a question of knowledge and awareness. Plato was the first to formulate the 4 basic virtues: Justitia, justice; Sapientia, prudentia, wisdom or prudence; Fortitude or courage; Temperantia, temperance or moderation. And then you have the Christian virtues referred to as theological: Fides, Caritas, and Spes. Around the year 400, Prudentius, that was a poet of late antiquity and the early Christian era, but at the same time commander of Emperor Theodosius' palace guard, wrote his Psychomachia, the contest of the soul, in which the virtues struggle in combat against the vices. This was a work that exerted considerable influence well into the Middle Ages. We have no original, this is one of the first copies of the 9th century, and you see here always the personifications of virtue fighting against the vices. Between the years 1556 and 57, Bruegel produced the preliminary drawings for a print series entitled The 7 Deadly Sins. I show you Avaritia, the print of Avaritia. Avarice. Bruegel is still working in this here in the manner of Bosch. The vices have been set in hell-like fantastical scenes and, in the form of personifications, integrated into their surroundings. In each case, the personification is seen acting out the sin in questions. So here you see Avaritia, then you have sloth, or you have Gula, and so on. As a companion to this series, Bruegel produced the cycle The 7 Virtues, but only 3 years later. To depict the virtues, Bruegel placed female personifications within scenes in which action was taking place. And this was something completely new, something that until then belonged exclusively to the iconography of the deadly sins. This having been said, the personified virtues remain in a kind of isolation with respect to all that is happening around them. And there is nothing about their behavior that manifests the qualities that define them. Rather, they are shown in a rigid pose, along with their attributes, in a way that had not seen before. Bruegel emphasized the antinomy of abstract notions on the one hand, and their pictorial concretization on the other by making use of personified virtues which were abstractions, and at the same time combining these with protagonists taken from everyday life. As a result, the degree of reality varies considerably from scene to scene. Justitia, I will show you this, and Caritas you see here, give a lifelike impression, whereas Fortitudo, in which a battle is raging against bestial demons, has been given a fantastical dimension. In the case of some of the virtues, Justitia, for example, the presence of traditional attributes make identification possible. I show you here prudentia and space, hope. Here you see prudentia with very funny, bizarre accessoires and carrying funny attributes on top of their heads. In addition to usual mirror, she's carrying a coffin in her arm and a sieve on her head for separating the wheat from the chaff. In other words, the good from the bad. Hope, you see on the right side, is balancing on an anchor in a stormy sea. The shovel, the sickle, and the beehive stand for the farmer's hope for a good harvest. Here you see temperantia, or moderation. Temperantia comes across as very bizarre indeed. She's standing with one foot on the sail of a windmill. Her mouth is closed on a bridle bit, and she herself is holding the bridle in her right hand. In her other hand, she is holding a pair of eyeglasses. On her head is a clock. Spurs are attached to her shoes. In lieu of a belt, a snake is wrapped around her waist. Prototypes for these unusual personifications can be found in French book illuminations of the year 1470s and 60s, what you see here. Bruegel's innovation, however, consists in setting these abstract personifications in scenes inspired by everyday life. He juxtaposes two different modes of representation. On the one hand, allegory, that is, a visual image that expresses an abstract notion. And on the other hand, a narrative scene. Bruegel does this in such a way that the allegory is seen as a standing for theory, as it were, and the narrative scene for practice. The depicted scenes come across not so much as visually representing moral norms, but rather as questioning those norms. Given the catastrophe and the hopelessness depicted in the representation of space, one can legitimately ask what could possibly continue to give hope to the persons here who are in stress at sea and in captivity or prison. I show you here the drawing and not the print. The anchor on which space is seen balancing amid the raging waves and which normally symbolizes aid and a stable hold, is in immediate danger of being pulled under by its chain, which is already in the mouth of a gigantic fish. Hope is thus in danger of being deprived of its very basis. In Prudentia, which, as it is presented here, has nothing more to do with the original notion formulated by Plato as sapientia, as wisdom, all the characters are only concerned about themselves. Prudence has been reduced to mere concern for making provisions, such as stocking up on food and wood for the winter and making arrangements to ensure personal health and salvation with the help of a doctor and a priest. You see it on the right side, you see the priest and the man, the sick man in bed. Traditionally, prudence is shown standing on a money bag, the symbol for monetary greed, thus symbolically vanquishing the vice of avarice. Bruegel, however, places Prudentia on a ladder that is lying on the ground. Behind her, a man is seen emptying a bag of money into a chest. Another man is walking away carrying 2 bags. The mirror in Prudentia's hand reflects not only her, but also the chest full of money. So we are to conclude that mankind understands prudence as meaning making provisions more in the material than in the spiritual sense. In Fides, faith, Bruegel portrays the rituals of faith. Fides has been placed directly inside a church rather than having had the building placed on her head as an attribute. On her head, Bruegel has placed the tablets engraved with the 10 Commandments of the Old Testament, which also serve as a companion piece to the Gospel that she is holding in her hand. Fides is standing on an open sarcophagus, which is not only associated with death, but given the presence of the anointing vessels, the robe with the dice placed on it, and the various instruments of torture lying around, it also evokes the entire context of the Passion of Christ and the empty grave. The rooster standing on the pillar of the scoring is a reminder of Peter's denial. So you see it on the bottom on the right side. The lantern and the money bag from which coins have spilled onto the floor is a reminder of Christ's arrest, Judas and the pieces of silver. The ladder, the lance and the sponge are references to the descent from the cross. One is struck by the fact that there is no body of Christ hanging on the cross behind Fides. Instead, we see merely the veil of Veronica, Vera Icon, hanging from the crossbar. Considering the vehemence of the ongoing debate at the time concerning the legitimacy of devotional images and, in particular, that of any image of God or Christ, the significance of this detail is volatile. The Vera Icon was also a favorite indulgent image, the practice of granting indulgences having been, in its turn, the object of one of the main criticisms leveled by the Protestant reformers against the Catholic Church. Scattered throughout the Church, the sacraments of marriage, communion, baptism, and confession can be seen being performed. And deep in the background on the right, one can make out the Eucharist. In the research, there is no clear agreement on whether Bruegel himself was Protestant or Catholic. In his days, this was a sensitive issue, one that could be a question of life or death. As the religious and political conflict between the Netherlands and Habsburg Spain was escalating continually, the Beltstorm, or the Great Iconoclasm of 1566, was followed by the Duke of Alva's suppression of the Protestant insurgency, and then in 1567 the Council of Troubles, also called the Council of Blood, and subsequently the 80 Years' War from 1568 to 1648, which eventually led to the separation of the northern and southern Netherlands and to the total decline of Antwerp. In 1560, Antwerp had had a largely Protestant orientation, and a certain form of criticism was still possible. Only 3 years later, however, such criticism had become difficult, and after another 3 years, it had become even life-endangering. In his representation of Fides, Bruegel does not take a clear position. He treats a sermon, which in the practice of Protestantism is of central importance, and the Catholic sacraments with equal weight. More recent studies have convincingly shown that Bruegel cannot be considered to have belonged to either side, Protestant or Catholic. His entire life work indicates that he, like a great many of the educated elite of his day, advocated religious tolerance that distanced itself from any form of church dogma or rituals. In the 1560s, however, a tolerant attitude was considered heresy, and the Spanish rules, the Spanish crown, being practically indistinguishably from Catholic Church, questions of faith were always at the same time political questions. Justice is depicted as a scene of judgment and execution of sentences, all of it set completely within social reality. In front of the courthouse, jurists are shown sitting in session, holding trial for 2 poor souls. A convicted man is being led into the lodger in the background. Close to him, another man is having his hand chopped off. In the foreground, an unfortunate fellow stretched out on the rack has a funnel in his mouth, and into this funnel a liquid is being poured. As we look progressively further behind all of this, we see countless methods of torture and execution being demonstrated, along with all the instruments involved. There are people being hanged, beheaded, wiped, and burned at the stake. There are execution wheels and gallows. The throng that can be seen heading towards one of the execution sites is reminiscent of scenes of bearing of the cross, while on the roadside, in the top left corner, one can just make out a crucifixion group. The visual analogy with Christ's death on the cross evokes a fundamental question of guilt and innocence. Justitia blindfolded and holding a sword and a pair of scales in her hands, is wearing an inner, a headdress once worn by noble women, but which had long since gone out of fashion. This headdress identifies her as a feudal figure and sets her apart from all the others around her. The personification stands for the notion of justice, that is, for the theoretical aspiration. The narrative scene, however, depicts ways in which justice is actually carried out, thus revealing the considerable gap between theory and practice. In research, it has often been maintained that Bruegel was illustrating here the dispensation of justice as it was known in his time, and that he was doing so uncritically. The accumulation of atrocities, however, and the fact that judgment is not shown here as an establishing what is right, as well as the obvious characterization of social disparities between the judges and spectators on the one hand, and the poorly clothed delinquents on the other, all of this indicates that rather Bruegel's attitude was anything but uncritical. The decision to endorse or not to endorse the practice of meting out justice, as it is shown here, is left to the viewer, who thus himself becomes judge. With Bruegel, the ambiguity that had only begun to become apparent in the work of Bosch develops into an actual criticism. What is good and what is bad appears not to be a decided matter. The prevailing norms are put in question. Today, we see evil being represented absolutely everywhere, particularly in film, somewhat less in the fine arts, but especially in popular culture, in comics, horror videos, computer games. Today, still a lot of work is done based on the dichotomy of good and bad. Although opposing sides often find themselves doing basically the same thing, namely fighting and killing, to the point that it gets difficult to determine just what makes one side good and the other bad. In each given case, it's important to ask the question, how is evil being represented? To what extent is evil being projected onto others? Onto people who think differently, people who are ethnically different, women, and so forth. Is desire for the diabolical being evoked? Are the powers that govern us being put in question? Are they being reaffirmed? Should we allow ourselves to become accustomed to evil as a result of constantly being exposed to scenes of incredible violence? Are ethical questions being raised within their larger context? Are we led to ask how things are systemically interconnected? In other words, do we end up asking how evil comes about in the first place? Do we ask the question from a psychological point of view? Do we ask from a historical and social point of view? Is there such a thing today as an unintentional evil engendered by new technologies, genetic engineering, or especially the capitalist organization of our social system? Yeah, so many questions, and I leave it to you to find the answers. Thank you.